Chapter name: Actions to address risks and opportunities of the environmental management system, Clause 6.1 of the ISO 14001:2015. Coverage in the standard. In this section, we have covered the requirements of Clause 6.1, including their subclauses, that is, Clause 6.1.1, Clause 6.1.2, Clause 6.1.3, and Clause 6.1.4 of the ISO 14001:2015. Reference clause within standards or the other standards which can be useful for this chapter. To understand the terminology used in Clause 6.1, we have to refer the definition given in the subclauses 3.2.1, 3.2.2, 3.2.4 of ISO 14001:2015. Further, Clause 4.1, Clause 4.2, 6.2, Clause 7, Clause 8, Clause 9.1 of ISO 14001:2015. Further, Clause 4.1, Clause 4.2, 6.2, Clause 7, Clause 8, and 9.1 of the ISO 14001:2015 will be useful reference to understand the requirements of this clause. External references for the chapter. Under external references, family standards, that is ISO 14004:2016, ISO 14005:2019, ISO 19011:2018, requirements of ISO 17021-1 can be useful material to understand this chapter. Outcome of the chapter. By learning of this chapter, you would be able to understand the requirements of the Clause 6.1, including their subclauses. Further, the auditor would be able to understand and verify the implementation of the requirement of Clause 6.1 of the ISO 14001:2015 and will learn more as below. Of environmental management system. Environmental aspects of the organization. Help you comply with legal requirements. Identification of issues and requirements from the context review. Brief introduction of Clause 6.1 with their 4 subclauses, that is, Clause 6.1.1, Clause 6.1.2, Clause 6.1.3, and Clause 6.1.4. Clause 6 of ISO 14001:2015 describes the planning of the environmental management system. Planning is an important and continuous process of the environmental management system. The Clause 6 is further classified into 2 subclauses, that is, Clause 6.1 and Clause 6.2. Clause 6.1 talks about the actions to address risks and opportunities, and Clause 6.2 talks about the environmental objectives and plannings to achieve the same. Under this chapter, we would explain Clause 6.1 along with 4 subclauses of the ISO 14001:2015. The 4 subclauses of Clause 6.1 is as below. Clause 6.1.1 General. Clause 6.1.2 Environmental aspects. Clause 6.1.3 Compliance obligations. Clause 6.1.4 Planning action. Clause 6.1.1 is general clause, and this clause focuses more on the planning of the environmental management system. Planning is an inseparable part and objective is to ensure that the organization is able to achieve the intended results of the environmental management system and to prevent any adverse effects and to achieve continual improvement. We can explain that the planning is a collective effort of the whole personnel involved at different levels. Next, Clause 6.1.2 states on the environmental aspects. Under environmental aspects, the organization shall determine the environmental aspects which relates to its products or services within the environmental management system. There may be direct and indirect environmental aspects, and under direct aspects are those which the organization can influence or control, and indirect environmental aspects are those which an organization can influence but cannot control. Next clause 6.1.3 states talk about the compliance obligations which is applicable to an organization. Under compliance obligations, we have to determine the compliance provisions and it shall be maintained as a documented information. Next, under clause 6.1.4 explains the planning action to address its significant environmental aspects as per clause 6.1.2, compliance obligations as per clause 6.1.3, and risk and opportunities. Requirement of the clause of the standard 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. 6.1.1, general. The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed to meet the requirements in 6.1.1 to 6.1.4. When planning for the environmental management system, the organization shall consider A. The issues referred to in 4.1. B. The requirements referred to in 4.2. C. The scope of its environmental management system and determine the risks and opportunities related to its environmental aspects. See 6.1.2. Compliance obligation, see 6.1.3, and other issues and requirements identified in 4.1 and 4.2 that need to be addressed to give assurance that the environmental management system can achieve its intended outcomes, prevent or reduce undesired effects, including the potential for external environmental conditions to affect the organization, achieve continual improvement. Within the scope of the environmental management system, the organization shall determine potential emergency situations, including those that can have an environmental impact. The organization shall maintain documented information of its risks and opportunities that need to be addressed, processes needed in 6.1.1 to 6.1.4 to the extent necessary to have confidence they are carried out as planned. 6.1.2 Environmental aspects. Within the defined scope of the environmental management system, the organization shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products, and services that it can control and those that it can influence, and their associated environmental impacts, considering a life cycle perspective. While determining environmental aspects, the organization shall take into account A. Change, including planned or new developments, and new or modified activities, products, and services. B. Abnormal conditions and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. The organization shall determine those aspects that have or can have a significant environmental impact, that is, significant environmental aspects, by using established criteria. The organization shall communicate its significant environmental aspects among the various levels and functions of the organizations as appropriate. The organization shall maintain documented information of its environmental aspects and associated environmental impacts, criteria used to determine its significant environmental aspects. Note, significant environmental aspects can result in risks and opportunities associated with either adverse environmental impacts, threats, or beneficial environmental impacts, opportunities. 6.1.3 Compliance obligations. The organization shall A. Determine and have access to the compliance obligations related to its environmental aspects. B. Determine how these compliance obligations apply to the organization. C. Take these compliance obligations into account when establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving its environmental management system. The organization shall maintain documented information of its compliance obligations. Note, compliance obligation can result in risks and opportunities to the organization. 6.1.4 Planning action. The organization shall plan A. To take actions to address its 1. Significant environmental aspects. Second, compliance obligations Third, risks and opportunities identified in 6.1.1. B. How to 1. Integrate and implement the actions into its environmental management system processes. See 6.2, Clause 7, Clause 8, and 9.1, or other business processes. Second, evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. See 9.1. When planning these actions, the organization shall consider its technological options and its financial, operational, and business requirements, mandatory documents, and retention of documents. Under Clause 6.1, the organization has to maintain documented information on several provisions as given in Clause 6.1.1, Clause 6.1.2, Clause 6.1.3, and Clause 6.1.4. These mandatory documents are as below. 1. Risk and opportunities. 2. The process and actions needed to determine and address risk and opportunities to the extent necessary to have confidence that they are carried out as planned. 3. Environmental aspects and associated environmental impacts. 4. Criteria used to determine its significant environmental aspects. 5. Significant environmental aspects. 6. Compliance obligations. Some additional factor. Under this chapter, some important topics of the environmental management system are covered, like significant environmental aspects, SEA, compliance obligations, which includes statutory as well non-statutory compliances. Significant environmental aspects are defined in Clause 6.1.2, which the organization determines through a defined criteria that what is significant after taking into considerations various factors as explained under various clauses of ISO 14001-2015. Further, the compliance obligations as defined under Clause 6.1.3 are a very important part of any environmental management system. Under this, we identify the statutory as well as non-statutory environmental compliances as applicable to the organization, and same are maintained as documented information under this clause. It's an important part of the environmental management system. Practice writing non-conformity under this clause. Under this chapter, we would explain the process of writing non-conformities. A non-conformity refers that the organization is not fulfilling of the requirement of one or more provisions of the clause of the ISO 14001-2015. It may be minor or major non-conformity. A minor non-conformity is the failure to conform to a requirement that in the auditor's opinion and there is no failure of quality management system. It may be a single observed lapse or isolated incident where there is a minimal risk of non-conforming product being released to the customer. A major non-conformity would be the total breakdown of the management system or one of its processes, or the failure to address a key ISO 14001-2015 requirement. Let us understand how to write a non-conformity through an example of minor NCs. Sample NC 1 AFAR. Common mistakes auditor do while auditing clause 6.1 of ISO 14001-2015. A. Asking irrelevant question for the organization. B. Sometimes auditor start thinking for the option while auditor need to understand the client process and to decide if the client can achieve the result of the MSS through their own process. C. Auditors start consulting. D. Auditors start expecting document and records in clause where this may not be mandatory requirement. E. Auditors asking for FSSAI license and registration. F. Asking for the GST registration. G. Asking for the ROC registration. H. Asking for the commencement of the business certificate. I. Asking of PF and ESI registration certificate. Dear friends, we have now come to the conclusion of this training session. See you soon with an exciting new topic. Till then, goodbye.